out of something Darren and I have been working on for a while. And Darren will kind of kick it off by, before we dive into the concepts and do introductions with the whole panel, we're just going to sort of frame some introductions and some concepts of what the background of the research is. So I'll hand it over to Darren.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Connor, and thanks everyone for attending the panel today. This, as Connor mentioned, is kind of giving some of the sort of background for how we entered this really multidisciplinary intersection spanning biology, technology, philosophy at kind of planetary scale. And it evolved a lot out of the work that we have done last year at this new studio called Inititated at the Learning Institute. And it's been really wonderful to collaborate with Connor on this project. So to kind of kick things off, really where we started in many ways was thinking about the seminal 1995 work by John Maynard Smith and Mary Starks-Marquez, Major Transitions in Evolution, where they really thought about the sort of informatic increase in complexity across different phase changes in evolution. These represented sort of the progression of the increase in complexity in life as it moved from molecules to protocells, from protocells to prokaryotic cells, and so on. But really, what it represented was the ways that information processing could be sort of metabolized, start replicating within these organisms. And it kind of brings us to this current moment as we think about this progression from these very basic sort of atomic structures all the way to multicellular behavior, then to organismal behavior, to even societal level behavior, as we enter this more machinic stage where we think about whether AI may represent this kind of most recent evolutionary transition. How can we think about AI through this lens of individuality and information processing capacity? And so that was kind of the provocation that got us started along this inquiry last year. And this is kind of contextualized by generally, given that we're here at the sort of planetary thinking panel, this notion of the sort of evolution of the planet itself in some ways through certain phase changes from sort of this bare geosphere to something that is living in many ways. This draws on some of the ideas from sort of Lynn Margulis and others, thinking about the Earth itself as this living biosphere. And now in this increasing sort of technicalized planet as a technosphere. And that, in many ways, can actually be seen through similar sort of phase changes. This is a figure from an advisor to us, the astrobiologist Sarah Walker, as we think about sort of the different stages of the sort of biospherical evolution as well as the technospherical evolution of the Earth. You can think about in the sort of deep history of the Earth, there are certain inflection points, such as the Great Oxygenation Event, when certain cyanobacteria really began populating, in some ways, literally sort of terraforming the Earth into this habitable, oxygen-abundant sort of environment that we live in today. And we can think of similar parallels in this sort of technologization of the planet, the rise of sort of fossil fuels, creating a sort of perhaps analogous great carbonization event in some ways, and these things being evident only through sort of the development of various planetary scale sensing and processing networks. In some ways, these can often have recursive relationships. This is kind of a nice case study, this notion of the ozone layer, which in the sort of late 1900s, we finally developed that computational capacity to really begin sensing and understanding, which then led to the intervention, the sort of Montreal Protocol in the late 1980s, that then led us to kind of begin reversing this the sort of pollutants via these fluorocarbons that were damaging the ozone. And so there's this often recursive nature too between the sort of geosphere, the biosphere, and the technosphere that we were very excited to kind of explore in various mediums. The other thing that kind of comes out of this notion of the evolutionary phases at planetary scale is this notion of biosignatures and technosignatures. This is particularly relevant in sort of the domain of astrobiology, when we think about how life may emerge on other planets. In particular, you can look at these, especially these emerging spectra that are gaining in resolution because of sensors like the James Webb Telescope that let us try to understand and try to sort of speculate in many ways the conditions, the preconditions that may lead to life, or the outputs of life. And that has been, this will play kind of a role in the film that we screen later today, the Xenoplex project. But there are also, analogously, these technosignatures as well, where we may look for things like radio processing waves, presence of satellites, these kind of technosignatures that may inform whether there could be life on other planets as well. And so, through this, we've been thinking a lot about sort of these phase changes at planetary scale fall into different kinds of paths. This is a figure from one of our scientific collaborators previously, Stuart Bartlett, where he's really trying to think about, are there orthogonal sort of means of how life could have emerged elsewhere in the universe? Obviously, we're familiar with kind of the biotic trajectory of the planet here on Earth, but there may be alternative ones as well. Perhaps ones that emerge out of more liquid or gaseous materials. Stuart has postulated about sort of Boolean logic in various convection cells. And so this kind of informed our thinking around some of the sort of contingencies and sort of the necessary dependencies in evolutionary trajectories. And sort of through this work, we really started thinking about the sort of base primitives of how life emerges. And this kind of brings to this point of thinking about sort of the evolutionary primitives of mutation, selection, and replication as a way of how information begins transmitting recursively again at this kind of micro scale. And in some ways, when we probably talk about noise later, mutation as this almost novelty creating primitive, much like noises in information processing and computational systems, that then propagates to create new emergent behavior. We can see this now in multiple ways, how this kind of emergent behavior. On the left side, we have sort of the canonical example from Darwin's finches of how certain behaviors can propagate in very different phenotypes based on the sort of adaptation that's necessary in divergent evolution. But we may also see places where there's certain kind of contingent paths, or maybe convergent paths, actually, where evolution then draws on certain phenotypes across very different kinds of species. This is a process in this particular case known as carcinization, where we see these kinds of crab-like forms coming out of very different evolutionary clades. And now, kind of in this kind of recursive process with the increase of computation of the sensors in the biological worlds, begin really mapping these out rigorously. This is related to a lot of Johann's work, building out tools for kind of aligning different biological sequences that let us start seeing how this kind of mutational noise manifests across different species. But folks have also looked at this from a more computational perspective too. A lot of our work draws on from the sort of late 1900s interest in artificial life. Could we actually engineer these lifelike systems using these similar rules of genetics and evolutionary algorithms in entirely computational models? On the left is John Conway's Game of Life. On the right is another simulation called Tierra that very much employs similar sort of base primitives of mutation, selection, and replication. And all of that has really led to our current moment of sort of large language models and AI that have also had this kind of evolutionary branching, maybe in this very emergent way. When you look at sort of the rise of different large language model architectures that have come out. And so that kind of brings us where we started with, as this being kind of provocatively perhaps the most recent major evolutionary transition, and kind of unites this theme across thinking about biology, technology, and using this kind of evolutionary lens. So with that, we'll move on to the panel. I think hopefully that gives some sort of base context for the kinds of research that we've been doing and sort of provocations we'd like to discuss on the panel today. We'll let each of the panelists actually introduce themselves and talk about how their work kind of relates to these topics. But we have Cecile Malaspina with us today, Johan Lam, and Christina Liu. So thank you guys so much for joining us.
Shall I go first? Okay, well, thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm always very excited when I get the opportunity to speak with people who combine a humanities and science background and want to think of the interstices between the two. I have an arts and humanities background, and I slid into kind of science of technology, philosophy of technology, philosophy of science by accident, you could say. So I feel like I'm acutely aware of the limitations of a humanities background when you enter the domain. People who've studied incredibly hard to know what they're talking about in the sciences. I think that it's a little bit true the other way around as well, but it's even more forbidding when you enter territories of maths or physics or biology without being a specialist. So it's both exhilarating and it's a way of being constantly out of your depth. Having said this, it's also a method for philosophy to give yourself the means to be out of your depth without being completely lost or without having what psychiatrists call a flight into meaning, without giving kind of hasty answers. It's a method, and it's also the topic of a lot of the research that I do, because I'm very interested in the concept of noise, and especially in the way that the notion of noise that we all know, like you hear a sound and you could define it as unwanted sound, or you could define it as a startling sound that you then later identify, and how the value we attribute to an experience when we call it noise, how this notion entered mathematical theory of communication, essentially, and cybernetics, and what happens once people who use the maths and the notion of noise develop a very powerful concept that then enters all sorts of other disciplines that no longer use the maths. So what I'm trying to say is that you have several transitions. You have a kind of common discourse notion of noise, of surprisal, and the value that we attribute to an experience that was unforeseen. That concept becomes translated actually first into statistics and thermodynamics, physics. From there it gets transferred to the mathematical theory of communication, which no longer talks about kinetic energy, so it just uses the maths. And from cybernetics and information theory it gets transferred to all sorts of other disciplines that no longer use even the maths, but still have the value that we first used in general discourse when we talk about an experience that was unforeseen and that we designate as noise. So I'm interested in what happens to concepts, what makes us think that we talk about the same thing, and therefore how, for example, if we have to tackle planetary scale problems like climate change and also political cohesion, how do we know that we're talking about the same thing? What are the important values that have to do with our specific situated histories, and so on. So that's the kind of out of your depth thing. With respect to this meeting, I was very grateful that everyone threw their papers into a folder together where I could kind of familiarize myself a little bit with where you're coming from. And I thought about it for a bit, and I thought you probably already know more about noise than I do. So I decided to take everyone a little bit out of their depth with a very weird, not very well-known theory about information by a philosopher called Gilbert Simondon. So it seems that everybody knows what information is. Information is what is stored in databases, it's what is transmitted in messages that in your emails that you send around if you know how to write a good email. Simondon is going to make us feel very unfamiliar with what information is, because for him, information is not what's in a message that you send. It's not even what depends on the sender's intention. That for example, I have in my mind, I want to either invite you for a party and I write a really bad email and you don't get what I mean, but the information was the intention. It's not even in the receiver who gets the information and interprets it. For Simondon, it has something to do with what he calls a theory of individuation. And the word, I have to do a little beeline, the word goes back to a problem of interpreting Aristotle in the Middle Ages. It became a very technical problem, actually a very interesting problem, and Simondon chose to interpret it in a way that has to do with what we call ontogenesis, or processes. I think the term comes from biology, where there was a theory that every time an animal is, from the fertilization of the egg to the maturity of the adult, the ontic entity, the organism, recapitulates the history of phylogeny, or the history of the species. That's where this term ontogeny or ontogenetics comes from. Simondon uses it in a much broader sense than that, as a critique. So he says, when we look at the individual, we ask what is an individual. Essentially, he thinks two types of answers have been given to this question in the history of philosophy. One was atomism. It's the individual is what comes about through the clinamen of the atoms, the movement of the atoms, their kind of chaotic movement and then aggregation into individuals. And someone says, okay, that's nice, but you told me how aggregates come about, but you just posit the atom as a given already, so there's an individual posited before the individual, and we still don't know how individuals come about. The other answer that was given in ancient Greek philosophy was the idea of matter encountering form. And Simondon says, okay, that's kind of a good idea, but you just postulate it like this, but we don't know how matter and form exactly interact to bring about the individual. So he uses thermodynamics, for example, and concepts from thermodynamics to, and not only, but also to have this kind of elaborate theory of how the individual comes about in the process of ontogenesis. And the reason I mention this with respect to information is that the two really big innovations I think that Simondon makes is, I would just say, so that we can contextualize it, one of the papers that was in our folder was about networks. I think it was Ricard Soleil's article. What did he say? He was talking about tinkering in networks of interacting parts, and he was making the distinction between kind of bottom-up or top-down organization of networks. And here you could think, to me it sounds like an atomistic kind of view. You have component parts, and you have to decide whether what makes this network interesting is how each component part reacts with the others, or whether the overall network structure influences how the individual behaves. And Simondon is going to say, okay, this is like the clinamen theory. You have individual parts whose individuation you haven't accounted for. And his theory of individuation, or ontogenesis then, is going to be this. He's going to say, it's not interesting to explain how the individual comes about, because the individual is only a side effect of the way that the system evolves. So he says you have ontogenesis with a big O, or the big concept of ontogenesis would be, you look at a system that is pre-individual, that is indistinct, indiscernible, but that is rich in thermodynamic aspects of potential, metastability, that has singularities in there that you could define however you want. I don't want to go into detail like this. He says that certain conditions will bring about ontogenesis, not only of the individual, but of a pre-individual system that will bifurcate, so that then you have an individual and its milieu, but the two emerge together and they also co-evolve together. So when the individual parts of the network, for example, or even the network as a collective individual, when you think about that in Simondonian terms, you will have to account for an entire system in which networks emerge. We were talking about convection cells, for example. And then think how not only the network emerges, but how the entire system within which a network can be, how that emerges and co-evolves together. And the role that information plays in there, I held my watch, but I forgot to look at it, so I'm going to close with this now. The role that information plays in this is not it's not a message between the connecting parts of the network. It's not It's not sender, it's not receiver, it's not the message. The information is whatever catalyzes the pre-individual system into a process of ontogenesis. Whatever, think for example of a saturated solution in which a process of crystallization starts and the kind of lattice structure of the crystal emerges. What is it that brings about the crystallization? That's the information. And it's not just the grain of sand, for example, that will kickstart the process. It is the fact, it's the signature of the readiness of the system to erupt into ontogenesis. So there have to be conditions of what he calls metastability. There has to be potential, there has to be tension. The system has to be ready. It has to be what he calls also problematic. That's part of the information. That is what he calls the first information. And what we call information now, with Simondon, you would have to put it into a wider angle and say information is the readiness of the system to erupt into a process of ontogenesis. It is the thing that makes it erupt. It could be a random event. It could be something that's an item, a grain of sand that kind of catalyzes the process. Yeah, that's it, essentially. So I hope I wasn't much longer than 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. We can just go down the line and absorb all of these and try our best to remember interesting questions. But yeah, I think it's good to get a baseline of where we're all coming from first. So, Joachim, if you can follow up.
Yeah, so hello, my name is Joachim Blom. I'm a bioinformatician, postdoc here at Giessen University in the group of Alexander Grossmann. And I'm working mainly on comparative genomics of bacteria. So if you're not that familiar with biology, that means we look into the DNA of microbes, and we don't look just at one microbe, so we don't look at individuals, but you never do it by bacteria, you always look at populations. And we are comparing different bacteria from different sources, for example, natural sources, or that might be pathogens that make you ill, or bacteria found in perfectly healthy people that don't make you ill, and the question is, what are the differences? And I was a little nervous when I got the invitation to come here because I was not sure how my actual computer science and the hard natural science will blend in here, but actually I found so many points to connect, so it's really interesting. So for example, you talked about evolution of information flows, and I was thinking about, okay, actually if you're working with DNA, DNA is just information. The genes on the DNA are information items, and there is a kind of a flow also in bacterial populations. For example, when people started, so when we got the means to sequence more than one bacterial genome, people started to compare them, and the idea was, okay, we take, for example, all, what everyone knows, Escherichia coli, we sequence 10, 20, 50 of them, and then we see the complete gene pool, and everything after that will be just recombinations of things that we already know. And people quickly realize, no, that's not the case. Bacteria are constantly exchanging information with all the natural world around them, and there is no closed gene pool for any, there are a few exceptions, but really rarely, that there is some closed gene pool for bacteria. Normally, they have something called an open pangenome, so they're exchanging information with the world all day long. And yeah, so this is something there's a huge information flow in biology. And also the planetary scale. So I guess you mentioned it, or and also Professor Leggevi, there are global crises, and bacteria play a huge role in it, because people normally only think about bacteria when they read in some sanitizer kills 99% of all germs, and then they get aware, there might be germs around me, but bacteria are everywhere. So in every one of you have normally roughly equal, maybe even more bacterial cells in it on your body than you have own human body cells. So bacteria just are everywhere, and they are in every kind of water, in every kind of surface, in space. So that's again a connection. So for the extraterrestrial scale, we are also in a cooperation with the German Space Center, and they are doing bacterial sequencing now on the International Space Station. So yeah, bacteria everywhere. And when it comes to evolution, of course, I have a biological view in evolution, so how bacteria in my case, or any other kind of organism evolves. But also as a bioinformatician from the computational scale. So there is kind of a rat race between the development of computer techniques and the speed of data generation in biology. So I brought some examples here. So I work mostly in DNA analysis. And when I was still a student, sequencing was done for, let's say, 2 decades with so-called Sanger sequencing. That's in 96 well plates, roughly that size, and you could sequence 96 samples with roughly 1,000 nucleotides, so items on the DNA. So roughly 100,000 nucleotides in one run. And then in 2005, I guess, the 454 company brought out this little glass slides with, let me have a look, roughly 1 million samples that are only on this glass slide, and you could sequence 1 billion nucleotides in one run with these. And nowadays you use these ones here. That's a chip of a so-called NovaSeq sequencer. And on this chip there can be more than 20 billion of DNA fragments, summing up to more than 6 terabases. So it's like a computer science, we don't call them terabytes, we call them terabases, but it's a billion, quadrillion, whatever. So a really huge number of DNA. So if you might have heard about the Human Genome Project in the early 2000s, the human genome was sequenced for the first time, and it took 10 years, it cost roughly $3 billion. On this chip you get several magnitudes of more data for roughly 2,000 euros. So, and that's the evolution of data generation that we have to deal with as bioinformaticians. And you might also have heard about so-called Moore's law, which is a law that predicts that the capacity of computers increases or doubles roughly every 1.5 years. And this is a rule that is holding since the late 80s. It's a little bit declining, but still is valid. But the increase in data generation, in especially sequence analysis, is exceeding this by far. So the sequencing capacities are developing much quicker than computer capacities, and that is something that really brings challenges for us as bioinformaticians. But yeah, also it makes it a really interesting field of research. And the last thing I just noticed while listening to others here, so again, when coming back to the information space, actually there are a lot of terms that are taken from biology. So for example, you might have heard an idea goes viral, so it becomes transfecting from people to other people. And also you might know the term meme, which is coined for some item of information in the internet, let's be a picture or a clip or something like that, that can be shared. And this actually is derived from the word genes. So I was thinking, okay, these information bits behave like genes in biology. We need a term for that, and actually this is how the term meme was coined. So yeah, so there's a lot of things that work together or that bring several aspects that from bioinformatics to kind of, let's say, like planetary thinking or information theory. So yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you.
So hi everyone, I'm Christina. I am an AI researcher currently at Oxford University. And in the past I was a researcher at DeepMind, now Google DeepMind. And yeah, I think my background discipline is technical kind of computer science AI research, but I would say I'm like quite intellectually promiscuous and draw a lot of inspiration from, like biologists like Michael Levin, who talks a lot about collective intelligence and sort of the multi-scale architecture of biological organisms. And also, of course, the philosophy of technology. So kind of, taking rigorously the implications of the technologies of the future and thinking about what we want to exist rather than kind of what exists currently. So yeah, some of my technical research right now around AI focuses a lot on precisely this topic. So I kind of am thinking a lot about this the hypothesis I have, which is that the existing machine learning models of today kind of are not capable of evolution and kind of create this sort of ontological stasis of the information that they produce. And I think this is kind of like a fundamental problem with the models we have today. So a lot of my research consists of like technical approaches that integrate a lot of different dynamics inspired by biological evolution to, create machine learning models capable of synthetic evolution and mutation, etc. And yeah, I think some of my more kind of philosophy of technology research is around how machine learning models can kind of, in turning their focus away from like a preoccupation with human culture, like most of the ones we know today, Midjourney, ChatGPT, towards, I think, the wider biosphere and towards ecological data, how they can basically lead to and promote what Darren and Connor were talking about in the presentation, which is like this evolution of a larger, perhaps like planetary superorganism. And like, yeah, how does AI as a technology lead to the next stage, the next major transition of evolution with the biosphere and the technosphere? And yeah, I'm quite curious about generally this multi-scale the multi-scale architecture of the organisms that develop. And yeah, I guess when we're building all this technology, we're building AI, what is the final end product? Like, is it just an ascension of complexity? Is it this, you know, megantropic technical object? So yeah, I'm really curious to discuss with the panel today.
Thank you so much. Okay, I have so many questions already. Also, before we start, I want to say we're quite a small group. If anyone wants to throw in some questions throughout the conversation, please be my guest. We'll set aside some time at the end also, but if you want to ask something, just raise your hand.
I got the hands.
Yeah. I could kick it off with one question, which I'm interested in listening to you speak, Cecile, if maybe one of the claims that we made is inaccurate, or maybe you can challenge it, because we claimed that in the evolutionary history of the Earth, there's been an increase in information on the planet, and I wonder how you would square this idea of the increasing of information with the supposed infinity of pure information, and if there is an opposition there, if we can think through the Simondonian framework of a true increase in information, or rather if information as a potentiality is infinite and therefore cannot really be said to be increasing.
I see. Yeah, I think there's certainly not, it's not a question of inaccuracy, it's a question of how you frame it conceptually.
Yeah.
If you want to frame it with Simondon, so leaving aside the question of pure information, which was a different problematic, but he has this idea of first information, which is a system. Okay, let's go all the way out. Simondon is also an unusual thinker because he was working with cybernetics, he was working with information theory in an empirical context in which a lot of people, systems theory, a lot of which came from Vienna and Simondon worked a little bit less with, were like all out against metaphysics. They said, we don't want to know about metaphysics. We just want to know what we can know in experience, and that's enough for us. Looking at the cyberneticians, I think they were more agnostic, and they felt like, okay, we just don't know about this, but we're not going to deal with metaphysics. In that kind of climate, it was, and also at the heyday of structuralism, Simondon comes out with a book on metaphysics, not only metaphysics, but an obscure problem from the Middle Ages that nobody had talked about for 700 years. And that explicitly was abandoned by William of Ockham, kind of Occam's razor, so that we wouldn't deal with all these formal problems, we just deal with what you have in experience, and everything that is given in experience is an individual already. So you don't need to explain how they come about or what is individual about them. That's too formal a problem. So what Simondon does, and that's why I'm saying all the way out, is he asks a metaphysical question about being not as something that is like a standing reserve, like being, like with Parmenides, being exists, but being as being rich in potentials, physical, chemical, kinetic, whatever potentials you want to think of, electromagnetic, and rich in singularities, and just something that isn't just passive matter, but that is ready to erupt into a phase transition, if you like. So it's a kind of abstract, big metaphysical claim, inside of which effectively it would make no sense to talk about an existing quantity of information that could increase or decrease. So with respect to the quantity and quantification of information, the real innovation is that of saying information is the signature of a situation that is problematic and that is capable of being resolved. So you have again, just his main example is crystallization. It's a bit boring to bring always this one out, but I'm afraid of going more complex than that. If you were to transpose this idea of crystallization, you have a saturated solution. Think about it more generally as a system that has dimensions that are not yet connecting. Another example I like is a lightning bolt. If you have a positive and negative charge in the atmosphere, if you reach a certain threshold, something can make things snap, and it will make disparate realities in that system communicate through the lightning bolt that will then resolve the tension, and will be this transitory individuation. There will be an individual, briefly, that is the lightning bolt. And to understand exactly each time the uniqueness of the lightning bolt, you would have to understand the problematic situation that brings it about. So if you think about data centers that have lots of data on them, or you think as an empirical scientist about all the data points in the universe, all the things you could be exploring and their interconnections, it's information only if it's part of a problematic situation. So it's what it is, it's just there. It could be information, noise, whatever. But for Simonon, it's only information if it's either a situation ready to be resolved, as a first information would be the problematic situation is the first information. And for a philosopher, you would ask, what's your problem? If you understand what your problem is, that's the first information that you have. And the actual process of individuation as a process of ontogenesis must be understood not only as the information that's stored and transmitted, but as a problematic situation that resolves itself in the coevolution both of a body of something, it could be a body of knowledge, and a problematic situation that co-evolves with it. So the context of it co-evolves with it too. So for Simonon, I call it a signature, I guess, because the word is flying around a bit, but it's the coming together of all these different aspects. The proneness towards a transition or a phase transition, the singularity that kicks it off, that kicks off the phase transition, and the actual process of the phase transition that would be the resolution of a tension in the creation of a transitory or permanent, relatively stabilized body of some sort. Is it too abstract, or does it?
No. I mean, just kind of bouncing off of Connor's question around sort of the quantity of information, and no, it was perfect. And I think a lot of sort of what you're talking about ontogeny, which is in many ways it's also about information processing more than maybe even just the quantity of information. And what are the sort of new substrates that may emerge that present kind of a phase shift in how that information processing happens. When I think about ontogeny, it's trying to process this sort of genetic information into morphological information. But then when I think about Johan's work, when we were talking about sequencing, there are certain new chemistries that emerge that then take biological information and then transform that, process that into the sort of data that we can actually process and analyze. Or Christina's work, you know, the sort of rise of graphical processing units, these GPUs that represent kind of the space in the substrate that then make it much more accessible to kind of transition this massive corpus of text and image, you know, on the internet into something that humans can then use in new formats. So maybe there's something when we think about the ontogeny is kind of what is the ontogeny acting on, whether it's a sequencing chip or whether it's a GPU that can then kind of present a new phase shift in how that information is processed.
Except that with Simonon, you would think about the ontogeny, so the coming about from fertilization to the maturity of an individual. But ontogenesis would be the entire system, the evolution of the system that brings it at the moment, I don't know, the embryo is fertilized until it matures, it metabolizes constantly the physical and chemical elements from its environment and the energy that is there. So this kind of threads together in a way that the environment changes, except we're not paying attention to the environment, we're paying attention only to the individual normally. So ontogeny is the byproduct of what Simon Dahl calls ontogenesis. So it's the resolution of a problematical field. I think you could say it like that. Sorry, but the answer was to you, the question was to you. I just wanted to reframe the ontogeny with the evolution, with the kind of context evolution. I don't know, sorry.
Good, it's I'm a little bit confused right now. No, what I really like from your ideas is, or what I can relate is, so I would not talk about problematic information maybe, but in biology or when looking at DNA, there is, it's technically not infinite, but even on a short DNA sequence, there's more information that could be encoded in it than there's atoms in the universe. And actually, you talk about there's random events that set things in motion. It's the same in biology, so there can be small mutations that really normally we don't care about them if they don't have any effect that we can observe that is interesting to us, but they might be really impactful, and it's more as a random process. And there's millions and billions of combinations of DNA that might be possible, but we are looking only at the ones that really appear to us because they led to something that is living out there, that is doing something meaningful. So yeah, maybe I can relate to this idea in this way.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to look at it.
I guess curious if you would think that each individual, whether it's like a biological organism or maybe a technical object, is it like a unique instance of ontogenesis? Or I guess when you speak of ontogenesis, do you mean like the entire evolutionary process that has kind of produced this particular flavor or species of?
Yeah, so it's like it's a question of revalidating context and minimizing what Simon Dahl called the ontological privilege of the individual. So repeat the question.
So is each individual, whether it's like an individual human, biological organism, or a technical apparatus, large language model, AI, whatever, is each of these like a unique instantiation of ontogenesis, or is like okay?
So in one system you could have you have in fact multiple, if not infinite, of these phase transitions or individuals that come about, bacteria, or in nested hierarchical ways, and all of these together co-evolve, and not only with each other, but also with what is not individuated, what is indistinct, where you cannot detect a structure yet, for example, or where you have a field, a potential, I don't know, be it electromagnetic or whatever, but you don't have a tangible individuated structure yet. So, but that changes together with all these individuals. So I'm thinking maybe another better example is, what was it called? Is it the name of? It's an Oxford scholar, I think, Das Gupta, the Das Gupta review on the ecology. I think it was a big review of economic models that historically had treated nature as a standing reserve, like a context you don't need to worry about. And in this report, he basically, I think, does something very Simondonian. He says you have, in order to understand the economy, you have to understand the coevolution of our economic systems and all these rational agents, supposedly, and their perfect information, with nature as a system that is an associated milieu, that is not the standing reserve, but that transforms itself together with the way that our economies transform themselves. So the individuals are all part of that, but it's not just a network of individuals. And even DNA then would be information only if it solves a problem, or if it creates a problem, I suppose.
Can do both.
Christina, maybe you could touch on, I think, this notion of like shifting from thinking of nature as a standing reserve with respect to technology towards something that's like much more integrated within its sort of co-becoming technology and nature. Maybe you can speak in your recent thinking about the relationship between AI and nature, how you've been thinking of this.
You mean like AI, non-human, ecological evolution?
Yeah, like more than kind of thinking about more the integration of these different domains.
Yeah, sure. I think, yeah, some of my more speculative philosophical research, I think, is kind of thinking about, like, basically where are we going with this technology? Like, what is it set out to do? And I think also, yeah, kind of turning, I think, up till now, humans and our technology have kind of co-evolved. And at the same time, our technology has acted back and modified the planet, the ecological, the non-human. And when I say non-human, I mean both, like, literally animals, but also like things like weather systems, geology, etc. And I think, yeah, up till now, we and our technology have co-evolved, and our technology has modified non-humans, but there has not been a possibility to allow kind of non-humans on the planet to act back on the technology and change that. And so I think a lot of my recent kind of more speculative projects are around basically creating like massive foundation models. So when I guess giving a bit of AI background, a foundation model is kind of the massive AI models that we have today, whether it's like the language ones like GPT, ChatGPT, or we kind of have like vision language models today, the ones like Midjourney where you can give it a string of text and generate an image. So all of these massive foundation models require a ton of corpus, a massive corpus of data to be trained, and up till now it has all been trained on internet data because that is like the largest repository of data that we humans have digitized and publicized. And I kind of think it's like a massive waste because you have this new synthetic processing capacity that can crunch information and make sense of it at a scale that was not previously possible. And you know, we're just using it to generate, I don't know, like bad arts and whatever. And so I think it would be much more interesting if we would take all of the information available to on the kind of planet, all the ecological information, whether that's like, you know, things like temperature, humidity, but also electromagnetic fields, waves, particles, chemicals, that are abundant sources of information that we have about the planets, and kind of crunch all of this multimodal data within an AI model and kind of make pattern associations across all of these ecological modalities that are available on the planet. Then we would, I'm sure there would be a lot of kind of emergent connections and relations that this model could discover. So kind of like Cecile says, you know, either answer or create new problems for us. So yeah, I guess I don't think this model that I'm talking about could exist in the next 5 years, maybe in the next 50 years, but I think with such a massive AI model that is focused on the ecological data of the entire planet, of which humans are only a subset, I think it could kind of close the loop between you know, non-humans and the technosphere on this planet, and allow for a more, allow for, I guess, this biosphere, technosphere evolution that also integrates the non-human.
Can I ask a question? Just, I was wondering if you could clarify what you mean when you say that non-humans don't influence technology or technological systems, because if you talk about weather, for instance, isn't the weather the one that is shaping the technology that deals with the weather? You know, like, could you clarify what you mean?
Yeah, I guess I know what you're saying, which is like, oh, like, you know, if it's really hot, then the data center is not going to run as well, right? Or like the data of the weather system is.
Well, the weather system was made to deal with the weather, so the weather shaped the weather system.
I guess I wouldn't think of it as shaping. I would think of it as like a weather forecasting system is making. It's like helping understand what is going on with the weather, but it's not like the weather itself can change what the model is doing. It can't, like the model is just doing predictions. It can't be like, okay, I want you to generate something else now. Does that make a bit more sense? Like I think in our current model, non-humans function as data, but they're not changing the algorithm.
But doesn't the data shape the algorithm?
The data kind of passes through the algorithm and emits like a final, like a answer or a prediction or something, but the algorithm itself isn't changing, it's just processing the data.
There's another question from the audience by Claudia.
Thank you for this conversation. Claudia Ford, I was one of the first fellows for the panel in the first year, so it's great to hear what you're doing. And really wanted, this is more a question of clarification, because what I think I heard Connor and Darren ask this question, is AI kind of the next step in evolution? With a kind of implied yes and an implied progressive stance, meaning this is a good thing. And I'm now hearing Christina, and again, apologies if I've misinterpreted, saying, but no, because of these limits that you've just explained, that it creates ontological stasis. And so I think, you know, the words that I've heard you use are, Connor, as I'm speaking about divergent and convergent evolution, but I think the word that you used, Christine, was emergent. And so I'm really interested in this because it does sound like there's a fundamental, not disagreement is maybe the wrong word, but a really different way of looking at this. And I myself am interested because so many of our problems with AI are about the information that we're entering in, which is human-centric and comes with all of the biases that we know and all of the problems of that information. So I really appreciate you, Christine, explaining there might be another way to do this. But if I'm misunderstanding this, please correct me.
Yeah, maybe I'll just speak briefly. Yeah, I think that's a really good kind of synthesis of what we just talked about. I think my position generally on technology is like a critical techno-optimist. So I think a lot of the systems we have presently are, you know, biased, harmful, perpetuate historical injustices in the data just fundamentally. But I also think there is a lot of potential in technology, and I don't want to close that off. And I think, yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about what could exist that could do something differently. And I think to answer your question, yeah, I would say the AI that we have today is not capable of evolution in and of themselves. And I think that they still kind of participate in this, in the wider evolution of the entire planet, but perhaps not in the direction that we want it to. But I think there is a way of doing it differently that can, I think, lead to something more interesting. I hope that makes sense.
That's great. I would just add on to kind of clarify how we were thinking of these transitions. In the major transitions thesis, there was basically each transition as we move from single-celled organism to multi-celled, etc. There's a change in both the way that information is processed and also the new unit of the individual that often subsumes the sort of previous units of the individual within it. So it's forms of sort of like emergent collaboration that then it becomes impossible to function any longer as something outside of that system. And I think rather than maybe making a claim that AI is exhibiting these sort of capacities of evolution, I think I'm more interested in making or positing the question of if we think of the emergence, maybe not just of AI, but of planetary computation, the way that computers are making sense of the Earth, can we think of it in similar terms of this sort of new level of the individual and the sort of loss of autonomy without that? So not as a normative claim, but more as an observation. I think the ozone layer example is one of that. So the ways in which a planetary sensing network sensed a sort of catastrophic change in the biosphere that then implemented policy change to then fix that. That is sort of a way of thinking of this new sort of level of the individual at the sort of planetary scale via computation. But as Christina really points out, like it's not something that we could claim or maybe even want to claim that this is capable of open-ended evolution, for example. So whether or not that sort of new sort of units of the individual is something that is beneficial to us or sort of destructive, I think that's a very open question.
I also wanted to make a brief remark. First of all, I wanted to strengthen Theresa's argument that I also do think that non-human or more than human beings shape the emergence of technology, or at least they shape how humans create and design this technology, and then there might be this indirect shaping. But then there's also more direct ways, like when bodies of water are moving waterways, for example, and structures. I mean, these are more like not as much digital structures, maybe, but also if you go onto the micro level, all microchips and computers and all kinds of technology also consists of planetary materials in the end. So I do think there's definitely shaping by the non-human taking place. And I wanted to ask you what you think about, because where I agree with you is that there definitely seems to be a difference that the non-human beings probably do not consciously impact and change technology in a way that humans do. So the question of consciousness always comes up whenever we try to conceptualize these new individuals that we're talking about in AIs. And in our research at the panel, we've been grappling with technological agents and the way technological agents impact planetary dynamics, and also the way human societies tackle planetary crisis, and this wave of like the ways that the opportunities that digital technologies offer us in terms of decoding more than human communication systems, and for example in projects like WhaleSafe or Citation Translation Initiative, and there's all these kinds of projects where humans have learned to use digital technologies and enhanced by AI, and that really actually enable us to get closer to what the planet is saying to us, or what the planet needs in terms of ensuring its habitability. So we are trying to grasp, to describe technological agents as more than human mediators, and so I was wondering what you think of that, because now that we have the chance to have experts on this topic here with us. Probably the question goes mostly to Christina, but I'm also happy to hear the others' thoughts.
Yeah. Wait. So the question is like, basically, how do more than human? Wait. Sorry. Can you maybe make it a bit more? So it's about how more than humans are already technical objects. That was.
Yeah, sorry that I wasn't.
No, it's okay.
Sorry, I wasn't really clear because there's always so many facets.
Yeah, totally.
But what I'm interested in is what you think about the idea of, because we were talking about how we label something, how we describe something, and if we term technological agents that are maybe equipped with AI, we call them more than human mediators who are mediating more than human voices. To human scientists or to human politicians, and what you think of that in terms of does that fit into your vocabulary?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, just to preface, I think I wasn't trying to say that there's no like material impact by the planets on technology, but maybe what I was trying to say is like there could be more interventions by non-humans upon technology. Yeah, and I think maybe where I sit on that is. Maybe I think I'm honestly interested in technological agents beyond just mediators, and as like another symbiont on the planet in and of itself. So yeah, I think I won't get too into like the question of consciousness or something, but I do think that while I think there is a lot of potential in technology as just like mediators between us and nature, between us and non-humans, I think I am interested in, I guess, their agency as in and of themselves as well. So, yeah. So, I don't know if you guys have
questions. I was going to just say quickly, something that comes to mind is sort of proliferation of genomic sequences and structural information, which some of which comes obviously from human genomes, but also a lot of which, as Johan works on, comes from these vast sort of microbiological and metagenomic repositories as well. And sort of the wealth of that information has led to this place now where, with these large protein folding models, we can actually explore that latent space of structural biological information, which previously, as you had mentioned, Johan, was just so incommensurately large that there's no way to really reason about it. And now we have this sort of tools. In some ways, this is an idea we previously explored, like the notion of cognitive microscopes, ways to actually go and think about these protein structures spanning so many different species, so many different classes of proteins around nature that is revealed in many ways because of this sort of phase transition in information processing and structural biology, led primarily by researchers at DeepMind, but informed in large part algorithmically by evolutionary processes, because this is kind of one of the grand challenges in structural biology for many years, is kind of predicting protein structure, and many of the sort of algorithmic enhancements and tricks really were driven ultimately by kind of understanding evolutionary dynamics at the sort of multiple sequence alignment. So I do think there are ways right now where there very much is this kind of recursive relationship between the sort of technical apparatuses that are being built and then their abilities to kind of understand biological processes because of sort of some of the intrinsic evolutionary mechanisms that are what drove those kind of biological processes in the first place.
Maybe one aspect from my side. So normally when we talk about technical evolution, or we're mostly focusing as humans on this apparatus evolution, let's call it like that. And one thing we should maybe be aware of, that the vast majority of any chemical process taking place on Earth is done by microorganisms. And we now have the means, by using things like AI, to model what's happening in nature, like sequencing things and then doing genetic engineering on bacteria, to really influence these processes that are on a planetary scale are much, much more influential than anything we can do in any kind of facility or an apparatus or something like that.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, sure. For example, so there are some projects now where people are thinking about, or they're calling it accelerating evolution, like everything. So you might know that methane is the much more potent climate gas than carbon dioxide, and everything that's this complete generation and the complete degradation of methane is basically done by bacteria. And if you could enhance the process to degrade methane, that might be, so of course you should not just throw it into the world and say, go for it bacteria, have fun, but in a controlled way, kind of bioreactors, something like that. That would be a really interesting process that we need more understanding about, because that is really influencing the planet. So, but it's a biological process, and still we can do evolution, so we can, by now we have the means to steer evolution in these processes, and we can use technical things like AI to better understand what's happening and maybe get a better insight how we can maybe influence it in a good way. But yeah, it's not without risk, too.
I was just thinking.
I wonder if I could throw a wrench into things, even though we have 10 minutes left. Basically, yeah, kind of leading on from your point, I was having a really interesting conversation with another AI researcher that has like a background in biology, and we were talking about the major transitions of evolution paper and how, we're kind of in the process of going through another major transition, kind of creating like a superorganism beyond human individuals, maybe a superorganism at the scale of, again, the planets, accelerated by technology. And I think we both agreed that this was happening, and I was like, this is so cool and exciting, like can't wait to see what happens. And he was like, this is the scariest thing ever, I don't want it to happen, because he was, basically his argument was that every single phase change in in evolution has led to a loss of agency of the previous individual. So like Connor said, it's like, so an example is like, one of the major transitions in evolution was moving from single cell organisms to like bacteria to, you know, multicellular organisms, and how basically once it moves from an individual to part of this larger superorganism, it actually, it specializes. So the cells kind of, you know, different cells kind of become speciated organs that do different things, and it loses autonomy. It actually becomes like simpler and dumber. So like the cells in your body are much simpler than kind of the free-floating bacteria. And another example is like the ants in a colony, which kind of also function as a superorganism, and a lot of ants cannot reproduce on their own. So they're actually a lot more simple than their close relatives of the ants, wild ants, I guess not ants, that are out and about as individuals. So yeah, his major fear was like, we need to stop this right now because I don't want to lose my individuation or in my own agency when I become subsumed in like a human superorganism, whether that's like a corporation or a larger community. So that's one wrench I have. And my other maybe provocation for Cecile is, I guess, I wonder if you've thought much about the role of death, or, you know, cell apoptosis, death of an individual, like as, I guess, yeah, what is it doing in this, what is its place in this like larger information system? Like, do you see it as like rebirth, renewal, opportunity for, is it information loss, or is it, you know, opportunity for new kinds of information, of like new individuals to take place and create new meaning?
Yeah, that's a tricky question for a non-biologist, but as much as I know about apoptosis is that when it doesn't work, the multicellular organism dies. So if you have, if your cells don't just replicate without dying, you get cancer essentially, or other illnesses that destroy the plurifunctionality of all the cells, and then you die. So yeah, that's someone who's written about this quite beautifully is Edgar Morin. Edgar Morin, he was someone, he's more like a mediator. He was a sociology background, and in the 60s, 70s, 80s, he was quite influential in France, bringing people from different disciplines together, very much like we're trying to do here, biologists, physicists, and so forth. And he's synthesized this in a magnum opus, which is a kind of multi-volume book called The Method, like a method of complexity. It's a biosynopsis, like, yeah, what is, I'm not, there's so many different questions in that question. I suppose what I'm hearing from what you're saying is the relationship between life and information.
Yeah, maybe.
And I don't know exactly, I don't know from what angle to answer this, other than the fact that, you know, if an organism, like you were saying, is a collective organism, like we are a republic of cells, you could say. Couldn't you say that? Something like that. Together with our microbiome and all the other bacteria that we have, like a kind of halo that lives with us. And clearly, there, the kind of life cycle and death of, I don't know what I'm trying to say, is I suppose the life of the whole relies on this constant recycling of cells, but this is also true of us as a species. If we, I mean, there are these hopes that people could live forever, and that would be very much like looking at society as a multi-individual, as a collective individual that doesn't have its own apoptosis. If the individuals don't die anymore, overall you'd have a kind of proliferation that brings the whole species down, I guess.
Do you want to add?
Yeah. I think social rules generally prohibit for us to go on apoptosis like cells do, because like it should be like it's a controlled process of getting prepared to be recycled without inflammation, right? No chaos, no mechanical stress, no white blood cells that come and inflame. It's like and it's
Self-destruct.
Self-destruct in the bathtub and we take your organism.
There are some individuals where you kind of think, where's the button?
I think it's one of the mechanisms of cancer it doesn't have, right? But then it's strictly tied to purpose, right? I don't want to sell tomatoes to the gardeners here, but it's actually purpose, right? Every cell has.
But that's what I think I was trying to say, is that I guess the question, do you have a biology background? Or?
Yeah.
I was wondering with senescence, the idea that we don't really know why humans die. Is it a kind of overload of complexity and some other complexity that makes us so fabulous and eventually it's too much and we kind of die in a heap of noise? Or is it too much inflammation? We don't know. It's true, it's much more complex obviously than an apoptotic self-programmed cell death, but it seems that in the kind of biosinosis, the fact that species have this constant renewal of their generations seems to be somehow analogous to the apoptosis in the sense that if you didn't have the dying of individuals in a species, you would have overgrowth, I suppose, of a species eventually.
It's just plainly speaking, just copy errors. If you copy sometimes something like 15 million times, one time after
so we die of noise eventually.
And Mother Nature is doing a great job, right? She's like really pushing it. Like I know it's going to go like 500 years, 1,000, but it's like it's a tremendous thing. Apologies, wanted to say there's like I think there's fundamental differences between how Mother Nature approaches evolution and how the new language models approach evolution. I think the fundamental thing is Mother Nature doesn't have an undo button, right? She never gets back to correct an entity that survives and has kids that run around. Either those disappear forever.
So what about neoteny? The fact that you can have certain evolutionary developments that then grow back and you lose some of the specificity that humans in a way are. Is that not like a reverse button?
Maybe it's just shutting down that sequence so it doesn't get read but it stays there. I think the best example is a nerve that starts from your head and is supposed to do something with the larynx, right? And in the fish, that nerve goes around the aorta, goes around the heart, right? And in the giraffe, you have the same nerve that goes out of the head and 6 meters down, around the heart, 6 meters up, just to innervate the pharynx, the larynx something. And no logical, technological process would ignore for millions of years 12 meters of useless skin, right? That's one, and she has lots of rules, right? I don't know. Every cell has only one copy of DNA. You can access the backup copy, but you can never look how the DNA of a neighbor looks like. A cell will never ask another healthy thing. Hey man, what did you write that down?
But don't they do that precisely? Is that not one of the problems with antibiotic resistance, that bacteria exchange sometimes genetic information?
They can exchange information, yes, but so there were several things I can connect to. So one is we are dying of noise. I was thinking when I saw your book about noise.
There's a question. I'm not a biologist.
No, technically you are correct, or you might be correct if you develop cancer because there's some mutation. Of course, it's bad for you, but evolution doesn't care about individuals, so it's all about populations. And so noise might be really bad for us as individuals if we get cancer and die, so that's of course unlucky. But without noise, without mutations, there is no evolution. So that's the driver of evolution. And if there wouldn't be changes to your DNA or to the DNA of every living organism on this planet, there would be no evolution at all. So yeah, noise might be individually really bad for you, but on a larger scale we need it.
And perhaps the question you should have asked him really, because the idea was the relationship between apoptosis, so so supposedly we say programmed cell death, and information. And I was really totally out of my depth.
That's
and
okay.
I think
Yeah.
you should probably.
So, yeah, apoptosis, I guess you explained it correctly. It's like a cell shows some wrong behavior, or for whatever reasons it came to the end of its lifetime and it just gives up itself and dies. And for a multicellular organism, this is of course important because cells can divide, and otherwise we get cancer, and that's not good. From an evolutionary point of view, for a multicellular organism, the individual cells don't take part in evolution that much. So they are just the cells producing sperm or egg cells, everything else has no influence at all at evolution. And after a certain age, or if you stop to reproduce, you don't take part in evolution anymore. We could argue if humans actually take part in biological evolution that much anymore at all. Because normally what evolution does is an organism, so there are random mutations and who's better tailored to the natural environment, has better chances of surviving and producing offspring. But we as humans, we started to influence nature in a way that best fits us. And so we don't tailor ourselves to nature anymore, we tailor nature to our needs. And that's not good on a planetary scale, most likely, but yeah, one could argue if evolution is still taking place 100% for human beings. So it's not maybe a philosophical question. So.
It's not. You mean that humans have stopped evolving because we are no longer adapting to the environment, but the environment is adapting to us. But haven't we done that, like from the start
of the success story of all species?
But is it not also the success story of insects and the bacteria, precisely because bacteria have created the environment in which multicellular beings can exist? And is that not, but that's the whole story of this.
The same. For example, you talked about antibiotics, and of course antibiotics are also some of them are things that fungi or other bacteria produce to kill their neighbors, because if they kill them, there's no place for themselves, so they influence nature as well. But I guess we do it on a planetary scale as humans, so we don't need a much larger scale.
But also insects, also bacteria. I mean, the very fact that we can have a biosphere, is that not? So I suppose you could phrase this in this big ontogenesis. So not just the ontogeny of the individual, but the system as a whole. Let's say, for example, the emergence of bacteria, creating or contributing, or I don't know at what level, at what moment in the history of evolution, the atmosphere became propitious to life on Earth in co-evolution with life on Earth. So it's the gases that become the biosignature, hopefully from a distance in space, would be the ontogenesis of a system together with the ontogeny of the individuals and the phylogeny of the species.